The notice arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail a man remembered later. Not because Tuesday held any particular meaning, but because the ordinary weight of the day made what was inside the envelope feel worse somehow. Elias Cord had been splitting firewood when the rider came up the North Trail. He set the axe down. He took the envelope. He read it standing in the yard with wood chips on his boots and the smell of pine sap still on his hands. 90 days. The land office used careful language. Words like assessment period, an operational viability review, and debt reconciliation timeline. But what the letter said, stripped of its careful language, was this: prove the Cord Ranch can survive, or we take it. Elias folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, picked up the axe and split 3 more pieces of wood before he allowed himself to stop and look at what he had left. 14 cattle in the south pasture. The herd count on his uncle's original deed had read 42. He did not go inside for a long time. The Cord Ranch sat on 430 acres in the Stillwater Valley, 60 miles southeast of Billings, at the base of a long ridge that turned amber in summer and gray in winter, and did not much care what happened to the men who worked beneath it. Harold Cord had built the main house himself in 1871, stone foundation and pine timber, a porch that faced east so you could watch the light come up over the ridge in the morning. He had always said that a man who watched the sunrise had no excuse for wasting the day. Harold had left the ranch to his nephew Elias in the fall of 1881, because there was no one else he trusted with it, and because Elias was the kind of man Harold believed in, quiet, deliberate, not given to shortcuts. Elias had been 38 when he took possession. He had come from eastern Kansas, where he had spent 15 years as a hired hand on other men's land, learning everything there was to learn about cattle and soil and water and weather, by watching men who owned things and men who lost them and trying to understand the difference. He had thought he knew enough. He had been wrong, though he did not yet understand in what direction. By the spring of 1883, the ranch had shed nearly 30 cattle to a combination of poor feed conversion, unexplained illness, and what Elias had come to think of simply as bad luck because he had no better explanation. He had let his 2 hired hands go in March when payroll became impossible. He had sold 8 head in April to cover the feed bill. He had ridden the fence lines until his horse was tired, and his eyes were tired, and he had fixed every break he found, and the breaks kept coming, and the cattle kept thinning, and the grass in the south pasture looked like grass, but felt wrong under his boots in a way he could not name. He worked from before light until after dark every day, the way his uncle had taught him. He kept records. He made decisions carefully. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He did not waste. And still, on the Tuesday the letter arrived, he stood in the yard looking at 14 cattle where there had been 42, and he could not tell you with any certainty what he had done wrong. That was the part that kept him awake at night. Not the fear of losing the land, though that fear was real and sat on his chest like something with weight. It was the not knowing. A man could accept a failure he understood. Elias Cord was finding it considerably harder to accept a failure that made no sense. He rode into Granger the next morning to send a reply to the land office. Granger was the closest town 17 miles west, a place of perhaps 300 souls, and the texture of all frontier settlements everyone knew. Your business, half of them had an opinion about it, and the other half were waiting to see how it ended before forming one. He sent the reply. He bought what supplies he could afford. And on his way out of town, he stopped at the post office because Walt Greer behind the counter had the look of a man holding something he had been told to deliver. A second letter. This one from the land office's regional supervisor, Roy Eldon, out of Billings. Shorter than the first. The office had contracted an agricultural consultant to conduct an independent assessment of the Cord Ranch beginning the following Monday. The consultant's name was Ruth Hollis. She would arrive on the morning stage from Billings. Elias read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat with the first one and rode home. He did not sleep well that weekend. The Monday stage from Billings came through Granger at 9:30 in the morning and arrived at the Cord Ranch Road junction at 11, which meant Ruth Hollis came walking up the last quarter mile of the ranch road on foot because the stage driver stopped at the junction and not at the door. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a ledger under her arm, and she walked at the pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be and intended to get there without dawdling. Elias was in the south pasture when he heard footsteps on the gravel. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped. Ruth Hollis was 27 years old and weighed 260 pounds and stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall in her work boots. Boots that had been used for actual work and showed it plainly. She wore a dark coat despite the June heat, and her hair was pinned back in a way that suggested she had done it in under 2 minutes and not thought about it since. She had the eyes of someone already looking past the surface of whatever she was examining, and what she was examining at this moment was the roofline of Elias Cord's barn. 3 men from town happened to be riding past on the road below the ranch. One said something to the others. Laughter drifted up the hill. Elias Cord did not laugh. He was too tired for one thing. And for another, the way the woman was studying his barn roofline, the measuring, unhurried quality of it, told him that her appearance was not the most important thing about her. He walked toward her. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "You are Elias Cord," she said. "Not a question. You are the woman from the land office." "Ruth Hollis, agricultural consultant." She looked at him directly. "And you are down 28 head from your last recorded count." He had expected someone who would walk around the property with a clipboard and write numbers and leave. He had not expected someone who had already done arithmetic before she arrived. "I read your file," she said, answering the question he had not asked. "2 weeks before coming. I like to understand a situation before I walk into it." "Then you know the situation is not good." "I know the situation as it appears on paper," she said. "Paper and land are not the same thing." She was already looking at the south pasture, where the 14 cattle stood in the summer heat with the stillness of animals that were not comfortable. "Show me the south pasture first," she said. He could have asked for her credentials. He could have questioned her authority. These were reasonable things. He did not do them because the honest truth was that he had been trying to understand what was wrong with his south pasture for 2 years, and here was someone who had been on his land for 3 minutes and was already looking at it like she had a theory. He showed her the south pasture. She walked the full length of it without speaking, which took 20 minutes. She crouched at several points and pressed her hand flat against the earth and held it there. She pulled up handfuls of grass and examined the root systems and let them fall. She walked to the near fence and studied the posts and the wire and said nothing. Then, "How long has this pasture been in continuous use?" "Since I took the ranch, 1881. And before that, my uncle ran it the same way, his father before him." She was quiet, the quiet of someone doing calculations, not searching for a polite way to deliver bad news. "The root systems are compromised," she said. "Years of continuous grazing with no rotation. The grass looks like grass. It is not giving your cattle what they need. You have been working against ground that stopped being able to work for you 2 or 3 years ago, maybe longer." She looked at him. "You have been feeding them, and they have been eating, and they are still losing condition because the nutritional value of what they are grazing is a fraction of what it should be." Elias Cord stood in the June heat and looked at a pasture he had walked across 1,000 times and said nothing because there was nothing immediately useful to say. "Is there a north pasture?" she asked. "Hasn't been grazed in 18 months. I moved the herd south when I lost my hands. Easier to manage from the house." "Then the north pasture is your best ground right now." She opened the ledger and wrote something. "We move the cattle tomorrow morning." He noticed the "we." He did not comment on it. They went to the water next. She was at the east trough before he had finished latching the pasture gate. She crouched and studied the inner rim for a long time. The mineral deposits there were white-gray layered like the rings of a dry lake bed. She brought up a handful of water and held it to the light. Then she brought it to her lips, a small sip. She spit it out and wiped her hand on the fence post. "Sulfate," she said. "You are drawing from the East Creek, same source my uncle used. Your uncle did not have a gypsum shelf collapse upstream in the spring of 1881. She stood and dried her hand. The County Geological Survey reported it in April of that year. The sulfate content in the East Creek has been elevated for at least 2 years, likely 3. Not enough to kill cattle outright, enough to suppress appetite. Compromise gut function. Your animals are not absorbing what you feed them because their systems have been working against contaminated water for years. She looked at him. "You are not a careless man," she said. "Your fence lines are repaired where you could reach them. Your records are kept. Your tools are maintained. You have been doing the work correctly. The ground underneath the work is what has failed you." He stood with his hands at his sides and felt the sensation of a man being told something true that he had not known he needed to hear. "There is a spring," he said, "to the north, about 4 miles. I stopped using it in 1882. Someone told me the flow was unreliable." "Who told you that?" he thought. "Orrin Patch, one of my former hands." She wrote the name in her ledger without explaining why. "Then, is the spring still active?" "Far as I know." "Then that spring is our first project. We redirect the water source this week." She turned and looked at the house, the barn, the angle of the ridge. "I will need the full expense ledger," she said. "Not the summary you submitted to the land office. The complete record going back to when you took possession. It is in the barn, top shelf behind the harness oil. I will need it this evening." She was already walking toward the barn. He watched her go and thought that whatever he had expected this assessment to be, it was not this. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open before her and read without moving for 2 hours. Elias had cooked beans and cornbread what there was and set a plate near her without disturbing the papers. She ate without looking up. He ate across the table and said nothing because she was clearly doing something and he had learned not to interrupt people who were doing something. Then she said without looking up, "August 1881. There is a payment of $340 to a surveying company in Dodge City, Overland Survey and Land Assessment Incorporated. The notation reads only the company name and the amount. No further detail." Elias set down his fork. "That is my uncle's handwriting," he said. "Yes." She looked up for the first time in an hour. "What do you know about this payment?" "Nothing." He leaned forward. "I have never heard of that company. My uncle never mentioned a survey. There was no survey report in any of the papers I received when I took possession of this ranch." "Your uncle died September 1881. That is correct. This payment is dated August 1881, 1 month before." She looked at the entry for a long time. Then she closed the ledger with the attention of someone marking a place they intended to return to. $340, she said, is roughly 4 times the standard rate for a boundary survey of this acreage in this county. A standard boundary survey runs between $50 and $80. The kitchen was very quiet. "Someone paid 4 times the market rate," Elias said slowly, "for a survey of this land 1 month before my uncle died, and there is no record of what they found." "That is the question," she said. "Yes." She opened her own notebook and wrote something. Then, "Do you know anyone who was close to your uncle in the last months of his life? Someone who saw him regularly?" He thought immediately of Silas Dern. "There is a man," he said, "older, lives east of town, maybe 12 miles out. He and my uncle went back 30 years. He used to come by the ranch every week near the end. Can you reach him tomorrow? I can ride there in the morning." "Then ride in the morning," she said. "I will assess the barn and the north fence line while you are gone." She returned to her notebook. He was about to stand when something stopped him. "The entry," he said. "You are certain it is not something added later? A different hand?" She turned the ledger back open and slid it across to him. "Look at the ink color. Look at the pen pressure. Compare it to the entries above and below." He looked. Same ink, same pressure, same hand. The entry had been made at the same time as the surrounding records by the same person in the ordinary course of keeping books. Harold Cord had written it himself, which meant Harold had known about the payment, had authorized it, had not told Elias about it, or had run out of time, or had not understood what he was authorizing. Elias slid the ledger back across the table. "In the morning," he said. "In the morning," she confirmed. He did not sleep well that night either, but for different reasons than the nights before. The north fence line was exactly as bad as he had described it, and Ruth walked every inch of it the next morning, with methodical patience, checking each post, testing each span of wire, reading the ground, before each step the way she read everything without hurry, without assuming she already knew what she would find. 3 major gaps in the north section, 2 posts rotted through at the base, 1 40-foot stretch where the wire had gone slack and been pressed outward repeatedly by something with weight and persistence. She stood at this last section and studied the direction the wire bent. East. The pressure had come from the west, from the ranch side, and pushed east. Cattle against a weakening fence drawn by something on the other side. She looked east. 4 miles in that direction was a neighboring property's unclaimed section. Between here and there, somewhere in the dry scrub beyond the fence line, was, if she had calculated correctly, from the topographic notes in the county survey, a water source. A tributary. Possibly the same watershed as the North Spring Elias had mentioned, the one his former hand had called unreliable. She wrote this down. Then she went back to the barn. She was measuring the grain store when she heard a rider. Not Elias. Wrong pace too fast, the sound of a horse pushed harder than the terrain required. She came to the barn doorway. The man who rode into the yard was perhaps 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, wearing a jacket that had been recently cleaned and pressed. His boots were working boots that told her something, but the jacket told her something else. A man who wanted to look prosperous without looking soft. He pulled up in the yard and looked at the barn and then at her. "Morning," he said. "I am looking for Elias Cord." "He is not here," she said. "Who are you?" A brief pause, the kind that comes before a man decides how much to tell you. "Warren Voss," he said. She had seen the name in the ledger. Secondary lien, filed March 1882. $1,400, terms that had seemed on the surface generous. She stepped out of the barn doorway. "Ruth Hollis," she said, "agricultural consultant contracted by the land office." He looked at her the way men looked at her. The quick inventory, the recalibration, the moment when the category they had prepared did not fit and they had to construct a new one. "I was not expecting a woman," he said. "The land office contracts on the basis of qualifications," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I was in the area," he said. "Thought I would stop in." "Your appointment with Mr. Cord is Saturday," she said. Another pause, slightly longer. "That is correct," he said. "It is Monday," she said. He looked at the north pasture, then the barn, then back at her, and she saw in his eyes what she had been watching for, not surprise but calculation. He had come to see the ranch before anyone was prepared for him. To take the measure of things when guards were down. What he had found instead was her. "Herd is up to 19 as of this morning," she said pleasantly. 5 head recovered from neighboring land through a gap in the east fence. Water source assessment is complete. North pasture rotation begins today. Something moved in his face, not what it was trying to look like. 5 head recovered, he said slowly. In the past 2 days. Yes. He sat on his horse, and she stood in the yard. Neither said what they were actually thinking, which was the nature of conversations like this one. "I will come back Saturday," he said. "Mr. Cord will be glad to see you," she said. He turned his horse and rode out. She watched him until he was below the ridge and gone. Then she went back to the barn and stood very still with her hand on the grain store wall and breathed out slowly. He had come on Monday to find a failing ranch and a desperate man. He had found her instead. And 19 cattle, and a water source already redirected, and a north pasture rotation already begun. She did not think he had liked what he found. She did not think that was a coincidence either. She thought about the $340 entry in the ledger and the name of a surveying company in Dodge City and the fact that Warren Voss had appeared with a lien 6 months after Harold Cord was in the ground, and she thought about the patience required to build something like that. The patience of a man who believed no one was paying close enough attention to stop him. She picked up her ledger and went back to work. Elias came back from Silas Dern's place at midday. She heard the horse on the gravel and came to the kitchen doorway. He dismounted and tied his horse at the post and crossed the yard with something in the set of his jaw she had not seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something harder than anger. The look of a man who had ridden out with a question and come back with an answer he had not wanted. She poured water from the redirected North Spring cold and clean-running well through the pipe they had laid the day before and set it on the table. He sat. He drank half of it. Then he said, "Silas Dern was with my uncle every week in those last months. He says a man came to the ranch in July of 1881. Said he represented a railroad company out of Cheyenne. Said there was interest in acquiring land in this valley for a spur line, and they needed to survey the property to assess its value for potential purchase." Ruth sat down across from him. "Your uncle agreed to the survey. Silas says he was already sick by then, not severely, but confused at times. He believed the man was legitimate. He authorized the payment from the ranch account and signed whatever papers they put in front of him." His voice stayed level. "The survey results never came. My uncle asked Silas about it twice in August. Silas didn't know. By September, my uncle was gone. And the survey company. Silas looked into it afterward. The company in Dodge City dissolved in November 1881. 6 weeks after my uncle died." The kitchen held a long quiet. "A company formed to conduct one survey," Ruth said carefully, "of this property and then dissolved." "Yes." She opened her notebook, wrote, paused. "There is something else." It was not a question. She had heard it in the way he paused before sitting down. He looked at the table. "Silas says Warren Voss came to see my uncle in May of 1881, 2 months before the railroad man appeared. Voss wanted to buy the ranch, made an offer. My uncle refused." His voice cost him something to keep level. "My uncle told Silas afterward that the land was for me. He said the land is Elias's. It has always been Elias's." Ruth did not write immediately. She let the shape of it settle in the room. "Voss offered to buy," she said, "was refused. 2 months later, a man appeared representing a false railroad company and conducted a survey that gave someone a complete geological and boundary assessment of this property, including the water rights and mineral content, without your uncle knowing what he was actually paying for or who was behind it. Your uncle died in September. The survey company dissolved in November. And Warren Voss appeared in March of 1882 with a secondary lien at terms that seemed at the time generous." "Yes?" "He could not get the land while your uncle was alive," she said. "So he arranged to learn the land's true value. And then he positioned himself to acquire it after through foreclosure at a price far below what this property is actually worth." Elias had his hands flat on the table. He was looking at them. "I have been working this land for 2 years. He said quietly. "I have worked it as hard as I know how to work anything. I have lost sleep over it and borrowed against it and let men go that I did not want to let go." He paused. "And you are telling me that while I was doing that, someone was standing behind me with his hand on a valve, making sure nothing ever ran the right direction." "The evidence points that way," she said. "And he made a mistake." Elias looked up. "He expected no one to look," she said. "He built this carefully enough that no single piece of it looks like anything on its own. The bad cattle, the contaminated water, the fraudulent survey separately, they look like misfortune. Together, they look like something else." She tapped the ledger. "He built carefully enough that he stopped expecting anyone to put the pieces in the same room." She looked at him directly. "I put things together," she said. "It is what I do." Outside, the cattle moved in the north pasture on good grass for the first time in years. The water in the trough ran clear from the redirected spring. 19 head and the ranch was not finished, and someone had spent 2 years trying to ensure that it would be. "Voss is coming Saturday," Elias said. "I know. He came this morning, Monday, to look at things before we were ready." "I was here," she said. What he found was not what he came to find. Elias Cord looked at the woman across his kitchen table. The woman with the ledger and the working boots and the eyes that missed nothing and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something more precise than hope. The feeling of a man who has been working alone in the dark and has found that someone else is in the room and that person can see in the dark considerably better than he can. "We have until Saturday," he said. "We have until Saturday," she agreed. She opened the ledger to a clean page. "Tell me everything you know about the cattle you bought from the Haskell County suppliers," he told her. She wrote every word. Outside, the ridge caught the afternoon light and turned amber the way it always did, patient and indifferent to the business of the men below it. In the north pasture, the cattle moved slowly through grass that was finally working for them. And at the kitchen table of the Cord Ranch on a Monday afternoon in June of 1883, a man who had been failing without knowing why began for the first time to understand. The days between Monday and Saturday had a quality about them, the quality of ground being prepared before something is planted in it or before something is dug up. Elias Cord felt it in the way he moved through each morning with more purpose than he had carried in 2 years, and with the tension of a man who understands the shape of his problem for the first time and is not yet certain he can solve it. They worked. That was the simple fact of those days. They worked from before light until after dark, and the work was not the desperate scattered labor of a man trying to outrun failure. It was deliberate, directed, the kind of work that has a theory behind it. Ruth Hollis moved through the ranch the way a surveyor moves through unfamiliar country, steadily, methodically, missing nothing. She assessed the barn timber by timber and found the east roof patch concealing rot that would fail again within a season. She walked the cattle one by one through the smaller pen and put her hands on each animal and told Elias what she found in plain language. She drew pasture rotation diagrams in her notebook and explained them not as instructions but as reasoning so that he understood the why and not only the what. She confirmed the spring water's quality twice more on separate days. She measured the grain store and calculated carrying capacity against current herd size and projected requirements through winter. Elias did not follow her. He worked alongside her. There was a difference, and he understood it, and it mattered to him. On Wednesday morning, he rode the east fence line alone. He had been meaning to do it since Ruth had mentioned the bent wire on Monday, and something had pushed it to the next day, each time the water redirection, the cattle assessment, the ledger work at night. But Wednesday morning he rose before light and saddled his horse before Ruth was up and rode the east boundary in the thin gray hour before sunrise. He found the gap at the southeast corner exactly where the wire pattern had suggested it would be. A 40-foot section where 3 posts had rotted and the wire had sagged to the ground in a long, shallow curve. Beyond it, the dry scrub of the neighboring property's unclaimed eastern section stretched out in the early light. And standing in that scrub, perhaps 30 yards past the property line, were cattle. He could see his brand on 2 of them from where he sat his horse. He sat very still. Then he dismounted and looped the reins around a standing post and walked toward the fence gap slowly, no sudden angles, no hurry, reading the ground before each step the way Ruth moved through the cattle pen. The way his Uncle Harold had taught him to move near animals when he was young enough that he had thought it was something you were born knowing. The cattle were thin, thinner than the ones still in the south pasture. They had been outside the fence long enough to go partly wild, watching him with the edged wariness of animals that had been managing for themselves. But they knew him, or they knew the sound he made, the low, even sound in the back of his throat that Harold had taught him, the sound that said, "I am not a threat, I am not in a hurry, I am here." He brought 5 of them back through the gap. It took the better part of 2 hours. When the last one was through and he had rigged a temporary mend with wire from his saddlebag, he stood at the fence and looked at what he had. 19 head. He had left the house with 14. He was coming back with 19. It was not a dramatic number. It was not salvation, but it was 5 animals he had counted as lost. 5 animals still alive on his land. And standing there in the early morning with the smell of dry grass and the particular silence of a Montana summer dawn. Elias Cord, felt something release in his chest that had been clenched tight for a long time. He could not have said exactly what it was. He did not try to name it. He just stood in the morning and let it go. He had found them himself. That mattered to him in ways he did not fully examine but would not dismiss. Ruth was at the north trough, checking the water flow when he came back. She looked at the 5 additional cattle, then at him, and something in her expression shifted not surprise but recognition. The look of someone whose expectation has been confirmed. "East fence line," she said. "Southeast corner, 40-foot gap, 3 rotted posts." "How long to a proper repair?" "Half a day with the right timber. I can ride for posts tomorrow." She wrote the count in her ledger. 19. She did not make ceremony of it. He appreciated that. He went back to work. That evening she laid the full ledger on the table again, open to the cattle purchase records from 1879 through 1882. She had been through them while he was riding fence, and her notebook beside it held a column of numbers being compared against another column of numbers. "Your cattle from the Haskell County suppliers," she said. "You bought consistently from 2 men, a father and son operation out of Caldwell." "That is correct. Voss introduced me to them 6 months after I took the ranch. Said they were reliable. Good bloodlines, fair prices. Look at this." She turned both books so he could see them side by side. "Mortality rates by year cross-referenced against purchase origin. The 2 animals you bought at the Abilene stockyard in the fall of 1882 are both alive and in better condition than anything else in your herd. Every animal from the Haskell County suppliers has either died or is in poor condition." He looked at the numbers. The pattern was clear once someone had arranged it that way. You could stare at individual facts for years and never see what they made together until someone stepped back far enough to look at the shape of them. "They were selling compromised animals," he said. "Animals that could not reach full market weight. Constitutional weaknesses, poor baseline genetics. Animals that a buyer with years of experience in evaluating bloodlines might have rejected, but that could be made to look adequate to someone in his first year of purchasing." She paused. "Someone who trusted the recommendation." "I trusted the man who made it," Elias said. His voice was flat. "That is not the same as carelessness," she said. "It is what recommendations are for." He was quiet. He looked at the numbers without reading them. "Bad cattle on depleted land," he said after a while. "Drinking contaminated water. 3 systems failing at the same time," she said. "Any one of them alone, a careful man working hard, might have identified it and corrected it in time. All 3 together compounding each other with no one to help him see what he was looking at." She stopped. "You have been running uphill in the dark, Mr. Cord, with someone shoveling gravel behind you." He looked up at her. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with the low, steady sound that was the constant background of the Stillwater Valley in summer. Elias had heard it so many nights from this same kitchen that he had long since stopped hearing it the way you stopped hearing things that had always been there. "Voss," he said. "The pattern points to him, yes. He introduced me to the Haskell County suppliers. Yes. He arranged the false survey before my uncle died. The evidence indicates that." "And the spring?" Elias leaned forward. "Orrin Patch, my former hand who told me the North Spring was running unreliable. He said someone with geological knowledge had assessed it. He never said who." Ruth had her pen in her hand. "Do you know where Patch is now?" "He moved south 2 years ago. Last I heard, he was working a cattle operation in Laredo, Texas. I have a contact who might know how to reach him." She was already writing. "Send a telegraph tomorrow. Be direct. Ask him whether he told you the spring was unreliable, and if so, on whose information or instruction. You think he will answer?" "A man who has been carrying something uncomfortable for 2 years often answers when someone asks the right question directly," she said. "People do not generally enjoy being instruments of harm, especially when they did not fully understand they were being used." He sent the telegraph the next morning from Granger. 7 sentences. A direct question. An offer to cover the cost of reply. His signature. He did not tell her how it felt to write it, the discomfort of asking a former employee whether he had been paid to mislead you. He filed it with the other things he had learned in 4 days that he was still working out how to carry. Thursday afternoon he went to find Emmett Hale. This was his idea. Not Ruth's, something he had been turning over since Monday, since the moment he had watched Warren Voss ride out of his yard with that calculating look. Hale ran a cattle operation 30 miles to the northeast. They had known each other from the stockyard sales, not closely, but in the way men knew each other in that country. Well enough to read the face. Well enough to hear what was not being said. He found Hale mending tack outside his barn, and they talked for an hour in the sideways manner of men discussing things they were not quite naming directly. Hale's operation, his losses, his debts, who had helped him when things got difficult. Elias asked questions that were not quite questions and listened to answers that were not quite answers. He rode home in the early evening knowing what he had not entirely wanted to know. Emmett Hale had a secondary lien with Warren Voss, signed in the fall of 1882. He had been buying cattle from a Haskell County supplier recommended 2 years ago by a man he trusted. His operation had been losing ground in ways that did not add up to the labor he put in. Elias did not stop to see Tom Vesper that day. He did not need to. He rode back across the Stillwater Valley with the long summer light stretching ahead of him, and he thought about patience. The patience required to identify a piece of land you wanted and arrange its failure so gradually and through so many separate channels that the man losing it never understood it was being arranged. The patience of someone who believed that human attention was limited and short and would always eventually look away. What Warren Voss had not accounted for was someone who did not look away. Someone trained from childhood to look at exactly this, the gap between what things appeared to be and what they actually were, the space between the surface of a failing operation and the real cause of its failure. Someone with a ledger and the patience to fill it. Ruth was on the porch when he rode in. She had papers spread on the porch railing, his title documents from the tin box he had given her access to that morning. "Emmett Hale," he said as he dismounted. 30 miles northeast. Secondary lien with Voss, Haskell County cattle. His operation is failing. She looked at him. "Tom Vesper," he added. "I did not see him, but from what Hale said, Vesper as well," she said. "Almost certainly." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come look at this." She had the water rights document from 1875 on the railing, an addendum to the original title filed 2 years after his uncle purchased the land. She pointed to the relevant paragraph and waited for him to read it. He read it once, then again. Legal language, but its meaning was not complicated once you worked through it. The North Spring and the eastern tributary were documented as primary water sources for the Cord Ranch property. The rights were permanent and transferable with the land. They could not be sold or appropriated without the explicit written consent of the property owner. "You never lost the right to that spring," Ruth said. "When you stopped using it in 1882, you did not forfeit the right. You only stopped using it." "But Orrin Patch told me the flow was unreliable." "Because someone told Orrin Patch to tell you that." She faced him. "There is a provision in this document. If a documented primary water source is abandoned without recorded cause for more than 5 continuous years, the county may petition to reassign the water rights." She held his gaze. "You stopped using the spring in 1882, 1 year ago. You have 4 years of protection remaining." Elias Cord stood on the porch of his uncle's house in the last light of a Thursday evening in July of 1883 and understood what a piece of paper that had been in a tin box under his bed for 2 years actually meant. "He was trying to get me to abandon it," Elias said. "If you abandoned the spring for 5 years, Voss could petition the county to reassign those water rights. A property without documented water rights in this territory is worth substantially less. The assessed value drops. The amount he could acquire at foreclosure drops as well." She paused. He already knew the true value of this land. He paid for a survey to find it out. He knew about the spring and the water rights, and he sent someone to make certain you gave them up. The wind came down off the ridge with the smell of pine on it. The smell that meant the temperature was dropping and night was moving in. Elias looked out at the valley and felt the weight of a complete picture settling over him. Not the sharp weight of new information, the settled heavy weight of understanding. "He has been dismantling this ranch piece by piece," Elias said, "and I have been trying to hold it together without knowing what was being dismantled or why." "Yes," she said quietly, "and that ends now." He looked at her. "Thaddeus Bryn," he said. Bryn was the land attorney in Granger, a careful man who mostly handled title transfers and estate filings. Elias had always thought of him as competent in a modest way. He was revising that assessment. "You need him tomorrow," she said, "before Saturday, before Voss comes." "What do I tell him?" "Tell him you have evidence of irregularities in the commission of your secondary lien. Tell him you have documentation suggesting the lien was obtained through misrepresentation and conflict of interest. Ask him whether that constitutes grounds for a legal challenge." She looked at him steadily. "Do not tell him everything yet. See what he does with half of what we have. You want to know if he can be trusted with the full picture. I want to know if he is the right man for what comes next," she said. She stacked the title papers with the precise care of someone who understood that the difference between a legal case and a collection of concerns was documentation, and that documentation could be lost or made to disappear if the wrong people knew where it was kept. He went inside and came back with a tin box and gave it to her without being asked. She took it without comment. That was one of the things he had come to understand about Ruth Hollis. In 6 days she did not make ceremony of trust. She recognized it when it was offered and responded in kind. He slept better that night than he had in 2 years. Nothing was resolved. The lien still stood. Voss was still coming on Saturday. The land was still 90 days from a foreclosure proceeding. But the quality of the difficulty had changed. It had gone from the shapeless, exhausting pressure of a man failing without knowing why, to the hard, precise pressure of a man who understood what he was fighting and was beginning to understand how to fight it. There was a kind of relief in that even before the victory. The relief of knowing the name of the thing. Thaddeus Bryn was a small man in his early 50s with large glasses and the deliberate stillness of someone who had spent 30 years listening to people's worst problems without letting the problems rush him. His office sat above the feed store on Granger's Main Street, 2 rooms, filing cabinets that did not close properly, a window facing north for even light all day. Elias had been in that office twice before. Once when he inherited the ranch. Once when he signed the land office loan. Both times he had come out understanding his situation less clearly than when he went in. This time was different from the moment he sat down. He laid the documents on Bryn's desk in the order Ruth had arranged them: water rights first, then the original title with its 1875 addendum, then the ledger page with the survey payment, then a written summary of what Silas Dern had told him, which Elias had written out that morning in the plain language of a man describing what he had heard. Bryn read each document without speaking, handling them with the care of someone who understood what he was looking at, and did not want to miss anything by moving too fast. When he reached the Dern summary, he read it twice. Then he set down the last page and took off his glasses and looked at Elias. "Who organized these documents in this order?" he said. "Ruth Hollis," Elias said, "the agricultural consultant from the land office." Bryn put his glasses back on, looked at the water rights document again. "This addendum was never challenged during the title transfer in 1881, he said. "It is fully binding. You have documented primary water rights to that North Spring." He set it down. "And you abandoned use of that spring in 1882 on the advice of a former employee you now believe was acting on instruction from the secondary lien holder." "That is what the evidence indicates." "Do you have a way to contact this former employee?" "I sent a telegraph yesterday." Bryn made a note. "Good. I need his response in writing." He looked at the ledger page. "Overland Survey and Land Assessment Incorporated, Dodge City, dissolved November 1881. He tapped the page once. I have a contact in Dodge City who works with the county recorder's office. I can have him pull the incorporation documents within 2 days. If Voss's name appears anywhere in the company's founding structure, it connects him directly to the fraudulent survey, Elias said. It connects him to a company that conducted a survey of your property under false pretenses, Bryn said carefully. What a court calls it after that we will see. But what you have brought me today is a foundation. He looked at Elias squarely. This is not nothing, Mr. Cord. Elias felt the thing in his chest shift again. What can be done, he said. If the incorporation records link Voss to the survey company, Bryn said, I file for a legal hold on the secondary lien pending investigation. Voss cannot foreclose on a lien under formal legal challenge. He paused. And if the full evidence supports the claim of conflict of interest and misrepresentation in the origination of that lien, if the court finds the lien was obtained through fraud, the lien could be voided entirely. Elias sat with that for a moment. You are meeting Voss on Saturday, Bryn said. Tomorrow. Do not tell him anything. Not about the documents, not about Dern, not about the telegraph, not about me. Bryn picked up his pen. Let him talk. Let him believe things are as he expects them to be. Can you do that? Elias thought about Ruth saying the same thing, and about the discipline required to sit across from a man you knew had arranged the failure of everything you had worked for, and let him believe his arrangement had held. I can do it, he said. He sent a second telegraph from the post office before riding home this one to Tom Vesper, asking to meet at the Granger stockyard on Friday morning, framed as a general question about the spring market. The reply from Orrin Patch in Laredo arrived Friday morning. Elias was at the kitchen table with his coffee when the messenger boy brought it up from Granger. Ruth was at the north pasture doing the morning cattle check. He opened the envelope alone. Patch had written in the careful, labored hand of a man who did not write often, but understood that this message needed to be written correctly. Mr. Cord. Yes. A man named Devlin came to see me in the spring of 1882. He worked for Warren Voss, which I knew because I had seen him at Voss's property in town. He paid me $20 to tell you the north spring was running unreliable. He said to tell you it came from a geological assessment. He told me to say it was my own observation, so it would not come back to Voss. I needed the work, and I did it. I have regretted it since I heard things were going bad for you. I will testify if required. You have my word on that. Orrin Patch, Laredo, Texas. Elias read it 3 times, then he set it on the table and sat with his hands flat on either side of it. $20. That was what it had cost to cut him off from clean water and set the third system of failure in motion. $20 paid to a man who needed work passed through a man named Devlin who worked for Warren Voss in the spring of 1882. The chain was complete. Voss to Devlin to Patch to Elias. Every link documented. A witness willing to testify. He heard Ruth's boots on the porch steps. She came through the door and stopped when she saw his face. He held up the telegraph. She crossed the room, took it, read it. He watched her face, the controlled stillness of someone processing information and filing it correctly, the slight tightening around the eyes that was her version of what other people showed with their whole expression. She set it on the table, squarely aligned with the edge. Voss to Devlin to Patch to you, she said. Documented and witnessed. This is the third chain. She sat down. Survey company to your uncle's water rights assessment. Haskell County suppliers to your cattle bloodlines. Devlin to Patch to your North Spring. She looked at him. 3 separate channels of interference, all traceable to one point of origin, all active within the same 2-year window. It is enough, Elias said. It is more than enough for Bryn to file the legal hold. She reached for her notebook. It may be enough for a criminal complaint. He watched her write. Outside, the Friday morning light was coming over the ridge at the angle that turned the valley floor gold. The light his Uncle Harold had always said was the reason to watch the sunrise. Elias had not stood at this window without the weight of failure pressing down on him in 2 years. This morning, the weight was still there, the situation was unresolved. Saturday was coming. There was still a long road between where they were and where they needed to be, but the quality of it had changed. It was the weight of work in progress rather than the weight of a man going under. He picked up his coffee cup. "When I took this land," he said, not entirely sure why he was saying it except that it needed to be said somewhere, "my uncle told me the land would tell me what I needed to know if I paid attention. He said the land always told the truth. You just had to be patient enough and quiet enough to hear it." Ruth looked up from her notebook. "He was right," Elias said. "He just did not tell me it sometimes needed a translator." Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. She went back to writing. He met Tom Vesper at the Granger stockyard at 9:30 that morning. Vesper was in his mid-30s, with the look of someone who had been afraid for a sustained period and had recently decided the fear was less manageable than whatever was causing it. They stood at the fence rail and talked in the oblique way Elias had talked with Hale, circling the real conversation, reading what was not being said. Vesper had a secondary lien with Voss, signed the previous year. He had been purchasing cattle from a Haskell County supplier, one Voss had mentioned favorably twice in the way that planted a suggestion without constituting a formal recommendation. His operation was contracting in ways that did not match his labor. Elias did not tell Vesper everything. He told him enough. He said there was a legal matter developing that Vesper might want to know about, and that he should speak with Thaddeus Bryn in the next several days, and that he was not alone in whatever he was dealing with. Vesper looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and said he would go see Bryn. That evening Elias sat on the porch as the light went from gold to gray to the deep blue that preceded darkness in the valley. And he thought about Saturday, about sitting across from Warren Voss and listening with the knowledge of every document in Ruth's stack sitting behind his eyes. Ruth came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the other end of the porch. For a while, neither spoke. The night sounds rose insects' distant cattle wind in the grass. "You are thinking about tomorrow," she said. "I am thinking about patience," he said, "about how long it takes to build something the right way. Voss built his scheme over years, layer by layer, each piece small enough to look like nothing. He was patient because he believed he was the only one paying close enough attention." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. What he did not account for, Elias said, was someone who looked at everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Get some sleep, Mr. Cord. Tomorrow is Saturday." He went inside. She stayed on the porch in the dark with her notebook on her knee and the sounds of the valley around her and the tin box of documents at her feet. She was thinking about what was in those documents and what it would look like laid out in the right order before the right people. She was thinking about the difference between knowing something and being able to demonstrate it with sufficient clarity that no one could look away. Her father had known the truth about other men's failing land for 20 years and had demonstrated it in report after report, and had never managed to apply it to his own place. She had watched what happened when knowledge stopped at the edge of application. She did not stop at that edge. Tomorrow was Saturday. Warren Voss was coming. And Elias Cord, who had been failing without knowing why, now knew why. And the knowing she had learned was always where the real work began. Saturday came with a sky the color of hammered iron, clouds stacked high over the eastern ridge, but holding still the kind of morning that withheld judgment about what kind of day it intended to be. Elias Cord was up before light. He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where he and Ruth had spent every evening of the past week going through documents building the case that Thaddeus Bryn was now working with. And he looked at the table and thought about what he was about to do. He was going to sit across from Warren Voss and say nothing. Not nothing in the sense of a man with nothing to say. Nothing in the disciplined sense of a man who knows everything and is keeping it behind his eyes while the other man talks. That was harder than it sounded. Elias Cord was not a man who found omission comfortable even in the service of something necessary. His face, Ruth had told him plainly, was the face of an honest man. In negotiation, she had said that was a liability. He was going to have to be something other than fully transparent today for the first time in his life in order to protect something that honest men had built. He heard Ruth's door, and then her boots on the floor, and then she was in the kitchen door with already dressed coat on the ledger under her arm. "Coffee is ready," he said. "I know." She poured herself a cup and stood at the window looking at the ridge. "How are you feeling?" It was the first personal question she had asked him in 8 days. He considered it honestly. "Ready," he said. "I think." "You will know when you sit down," she said. "Readiness is not something you can confirm in advance." They rode to Granger together, not talking much the way people rode who had worked alongside each other long enough that silence carried its own meaning. The valley spread around them in the gray morning light, the grass still holding its summer yellow, the distant mountains marking the edge of the world the way they always did, permanent belonging to no one. Thaddeus Bryn met them outside the land office building at 9:15. He wore the composed expression of a man who had been up since before light himself, which meant the news from Dodge City had arrived. "Walk with me," he said quietly. They moved half a block to the narrow alley between the feed store and the harness shop. Bryn pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Incorporation records for Overland Survey and Land Assessment Incorporated," he said, keeping his voice low. "Filed in Dodge City, March 1880, dissolved November 1881. He opened the paper. "The founding partners are listed under 2 business names, shell names, both of them. But my contact in Dodge City knows how to read a filing, and behind the second shell name is a 40% equity stake registered to a Warren Eldon Voss of Granger, Montana Territory." The alley was very quiet. "His name is in the company," Elias said. "2 layers deep," Bryn said, "which tells you something about how carefully this was arranged. But it is there. Legally and formally there." He folded the paper. "Combined with the Dern statement, the patch telegraph, and the water rights documentation, we have sufficient grounds to file for a legal hold on the secondary line this morning before you walk into that meeting." Elias looked at him. "This morning?" "I filed 20 minutes ago," Bryn said. "The hold is on record with the county clerk. Voss cannot foreclose on a lien under formal legal challenge. Whatever he says to you in that room today, whatever pressure he applies, the legal ground has already shifted." He looked at Elias steadily. "He does not know that yet." Ruth had been listening. Now she said, "What else did you file?" Bryn looked at her with the expression he had worn since Elias first introduced them, a man continuously revising an assessment he had made too quickly. "A separate complaint with the county sheriff's office," he said. "Potential fraud in the commission of a financial agreement. It will move slower than the civil filing, but it is on record." He paused. "I also sent word to Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper. Both came to my office yesterday evening. Both provided statements. Both are filing challenges to their own secondary liens this week." Elias thought of Hale at his fence rail, of Vesper at the stockyard, with the look of a man who had decided to stop being afraid. 3 properties, Ruth said quietly. 3 lien challenges, filed simultaneously. "Yes," Bryn said. "The simultaneity demonstrates pattern rather than individual grievance." They went into the meeting at 10 o'clock. The land office conference room was plain, a long table, 6 chairs, a window facing the street. Roy Eldon, the regional supervisor from Billings, sat at the head of the table. He had the slightly harried look of a man who had received several communications that morning and had not yet fully sorted them. Warren Voss was there. He sat on the far side of the table in a jacket better than last Tuesday's and the same working boots. And he had brought a lawyer, a man from outside the county, which told Elias everything he needed to know about how seriously Voss was taking this morning. Elias sat down across from Voss. He looked at the man directly. Voss met his eyes with the practiced steadiness of someone accustomed to rooms like this one. There was nothing in Voss's face that looked like guilt. There was nothing that looked like anything other than a successful man conducting business. Elias had known men like that. Men for whom the arrangement of their face was as carefully managed as any other instrument. He kept his own face quiet and let Eldon open the meeting. Eldon spoke for several minutes about the assessment process, the terms of the operational review period, the land office's obligations under the loan agreement. He spoke with the measured care of a man who sensed something was happening he did not yet fully understand. Then he turned to Ruth and asked for the preliminary assessment report. She slid it across the table. Eldon began to read. Voss's lawyer leaned toward Voss and said something quiet. Voss's eyes moved to the report in Eldon's hands, then to Ruth, then to Elias, then back to the report. Elias said nothing. Eldon read for 3 full minutes without speaking. Then he looked up. The herd count is listed here as 19 head as of last Wednesday. The previous recorded count was 14. 5 additional head were recovered from neighboring land through a gap in the east fence boundary, Ruth said. Recovered and returned to the property by Mr. Cord on Wednesday morning. The water source has been redirected. Day 2 of the assessment. North Spring documented as a primary water right under the 1875 title addendum. Flow confirmed clean and adequate for current herd requirements. Eldon looked at the report again. His expression had moved from cautious to something more engaged. Voss's lawyer raised the question of Ruth's professional credentials, the licensing argument framed in careful legal language. He was good. The argument was constructed well enough that someone unfamiliar with the contract language might have found it convincing. Ruth let him finish. Then, the contract between the land office and myself describes the engagement as an agricultural consultancy. The specific language is on page 1, paragraph 2. There is no licensing requirement for consultancy work in this state as distinct from licensed assessment work. The services contracted were within the precise scope of my professional capacity. She said it the way she said most things, without edge, without performance, with the confidence of someone who has checked the fact and is not presenting an opinion, but a conclusion. Eldon pulled the contract from his folder and read the relevant paragraph. Twice. Then he set it down and looked at the lawyer. The lawyer pivoted. He argued that the practical effect of Ruth's work constituted the function of a licensed position, regardless of the contract language. Eldon said, I am looking at a report that documents 19 head of cattle recovered water access, north pasture rotation in progress, and measurable improvement in operational indicators across 8 days of field work. He set the report down. The question before this office is whether the Cord Ranch is showing a viable recovery trajectory. This report suggests it is. Voss spoke for the first time. His voice was what it always was, measured, reasonable, the voice of a man who considered himself the most sensible person in whatever room he entered. He said he had significant concerns about the adequacy of an 8-day assessment to address long-term viability. He said the process deserved more rigorous oversight. He said these things in the tone of a man performing reasonableness for an audience. Elias watched him perform it and said nothing. Then Eldon said something that changed the quality of the air in the room. Mr. Voss, Eldon said, looking at a paper that had appeared on the table in front of him. I received a communication this morning from the county clerk's office regarding a legal hold filed on the secondary lien on the Cord Ranch property. He looked up. Are you aware of this filing? The room went very still. Something moved behind Voss's eyes. Something that was not the performed reasonableness, something older and colder. I was not aware, he said carefully. The filing also references a separate complaint with the county sheriff's office regarding the origination of the lien. Eldon set the paper down. I want to be transparent with everyone present. The land office takes matters of lien integrity very seriously, particularly when they intersect with an active operational assessment. He looked at Voss's lawyer. I would suggest your client consult with you thoroughly before this meeting proceeds further. Voss and his lawyer left the room. They returned after 12 minutes. Voss sat with a composed face still in place, but it was costing him more. The easiness was gone from his shoulders. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, procedural matters, reporting schedules, documentation requirements. Eldon confirmed that the operational loan would not be called while the assessment was ongoing and the legal hold was in place. He accepted Ruth's preliminary report into the formal record. When it ended, Voss walked out without courtesy of goodbye to anyone at the table. Elias stood and picked up his hat and walked out into the Saturday street. Voss was waiting for him around the corner in the narrow space between the land office and the adjacent building where the foot traffic did not go. Alone. The lawyer was somewhere else, which meant this was not legal business. "Elias," Voss said. His voice had shed the performed reasonableness entirely. What was underneath was harder and more honest, and Elias found he preferred it to the performance. "Warren," Elias said. "This does not have to go the direction it is going," Voss said. "I am prepared to settle the lien at a reduced figure. Clear the debt, put money in your pocket. Leave you with enough to start fresh somewhere else. You are a good man who has had a hard time of it. I have always thought so." Elias looked at him. "Your uncle," Voss said, and his voice shifted to something calibrated as sympathy, "came to me voluntarily in the summer of 1881. He was worried about what came after him. He was not certain you had the capacity to run a ranch of this size. He wanted the land to go to someone who would make something of it." The morning street continued around the corner. Horses' commerce, voices the ordinary sounds of a Saturday in a small town, continuing as though nothing particular was happening in this narrow space between two buildings. Elias stood with the words settling. He felt them land. He felt the place they were aimed at, the place where a man's doubt about himself lived, the place that never fully healed, no matter how much work you laid over it. He stood with it. Then he thought about Silas Dern sitting in his farmhouse east of town, saying in his unhurried way, "Your uncle talked about you every week in those months. He said the land is Elias's. It has always been Elias's." He thought about a letter written on the 28th of August, 1881, by a man running out of time but not out of clarity. "Silas Dern sat with my uncle every week in those last months," Elias said. His voice was even. "Every week without exception. He never mentioned my uncle wanting to sell, not once. What my uncle mentioned, the only thing Silas ever heard him say about what came after, was me." Voss said nothing. "You built something careful," Elias said. "Patient and thorough. You understood that a man working alone does not always see what is happening at the edges of his own land." He paused. "You made one mistake." Voss held his gaze, said nothing. "You assumed no one would look," Elias said. "You assumed no one would sit down with the ledger and the water rights document and the title addendum and the cattle records and put them all in the same room at the same time and trace every thread back to where it started." He picked up his hat. "Someone looked." He walked back around the corner into the street and did not look back. Ruth was waiting at the horses. She read his face when he came around the corner, the skill she had of reading the information a face carried without requiring it to be put into words. "He tried to put doubt in you," she said, "about my uncle. Did it work?" He thought about the narrow space between the buildings, about where the words had been aimed. "For about 10 seconds, he said. She untied his horse and handed him the reins. 10 seconds is honest, she said. They rode home. The 6 weeks that followed had a different quality than the 6 before. The first 6 weeks on the Cord Ranch had been weeks of uncovering following evidence from one buried fact to the next, building the legal foundation that Bryn was working with. These weeks were the weeks of demonstration, of proof made visible. The cattle in the north pasture gained weight steadily in documented weekly increments that Ruth recorded every Wednesday morning. The clean water from the North Spring ran by the 3rd week into a second trough at the east end of the property, expanding the accessible range for the herd. The south pasture rested and unworked for the first time in 8 years. Began the slow process of root system recovery that Ruth had predicted would take 2 to 3 seasons to complete. But that was already showing early indicators in the soil quality she assessed on her hands and knees every 2 weeks. The herd count reached 22 in the 5th week when one of the recovered east fence cattle delivered a healthy calf. Ruth noted in her ledger that the mother's improved condition over the preceding weeks had contributed directly to a successful delivery. Not because it was dramatic, Because it was proof. Cause and effect documented, traceable, visible in the living weight of a calf that would not have survived if the water had stayed contaminated and the cattle had remained on depleted ground. Elias worked the fence lines until they were tight. He rebuilt the east section properly. New posts, clean wire, nothing temporary. He repaired the north barn roof the right way, replacing the substructure that had been concealed under the bad patch before laying new timber over it. He rode the property boundary every week, the way Harold had taught him, looking for what was changing before the change became a problem. He worked differently than before. Not harder, he had always worked as hard as a man could work. With a different quality of attention, the attention of someone who understood the connection between cause and effect in a living system, who could see how soil and water and grass and animals were all part of the same organism, and that a failure in one part did not stay in one part. Ruth had not lectured him on this. She had shown him how she looked at things and then given him room to look. In the fourth week, Devlin Warren Voss's former foreman was brought in for questioning by the county sheriff's office. Bryn had provided the patch telegraph and the Dern statement to the sheriff, and a deputy had ridden to Laredo to take Orrin Patch's formal sworn testimony. Devlin, faced with a witness who had already testified and a document chain that named him by name, made the decision that men made when the full architecture of a lie was laid out in front of them. He talked. He talked for 4 hours, and what he described filled in the spaces between what Elias and Ruth had assembled, the specific conversations, the specific instructions, the specific payments. He confirmed the Haskell County cattle arrangement. He confirmed the patch deception. He confirmed that Voss had known about the water rights document from the moment the Dodge City survey was completed, and had spent 2 years working to make Elias abandon the spring before the 5-year window expired. He also confirmed that Voss had used the geological information from the fraudulent survey to purchase a separate parcel in an adjacent valley, a transaction made with knowledge of underground water access that the seller had not known about, and that made the land worth considerably more than the price paid. This was a detail that had not appeared in any of the documents Ruth had assembled. It came from Devlin alone, and it changed the scale of what they were looking at. This was not a single act of opportunism against one man's ranch. Warren Voss had been building something. Slowly over years, using the same instruments each time, false surveys, bad cattle, manipulated water access, debt positioned for foreclosure. Elias Cord was not the first. He was unlikely to be the last. Bryn filed the amended complaint with this additional information on a Wednesday morning. The county sheriff's office forwarded the full case file to the territorial attorney's office in Helena the following day. On a Friday afternoon in mid-September, 6 weeks and 2 days after the Saturday meeting in Granger, the county court issued its order. The secondary lien on the Cord Ranch was voided. The court found that the lien had been obtained through misrepresentation and conflict of interest, that the lien holder had actively engaged in conduct designed to devalue the secured asset, and that the instrument was void as a matter of law. Bryn sent a rider to the ranch with the court order that same afternoon. Elias was splitting wood when the rider came up the north trail. The same trail the first rider had come up with the land office notice 90 days before. He set the axe down. He took the envelope. He read it standing in the yard with the September light on the ridge and the smell of the first cold coming down from elevation. Then he walked to the north pasture. Ruth was doing the Wednesday cattle count. She never missed a Wednesday count, moving through the herd with the unhurried attention she brought to everything. He stood at the fence and watched her work. She knew he was there. She finished the count. She made the notation in her ledger, then she walked to the fence. He held out the court order. She took it, read it, set it against the fence post with the care she gave all documents. 24 head, she said, as of this morning. From 14, he said. From 14, she confirmed. He looked at the pasture, the grass that was genuinely working now, the cattle gaining weight each week, the water running clean from the north spring into both troughs. The fence lines tight, the barn roof solid, the south pasture resting and recovering the way damaged land recovered when you gave it what it needed and left it alone. He had built this. With help he had not known to ask for, with guidance he had not known he needed, but with his own hands and his own labor and his own willingness to look at what was true, even when what was true was hard. "What happens to Voss?" he asked. "Bryn said the territorial attorney's office is reviewing the full case file," Ruth said. "The criminal charges will take longer than the civil matter. But Devlin's testimony is substantial, and the documentary evidence is clear. Bryn believes there will be formal charges." She paused. "Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper have both received lien voiding orders this week as well. Their challenges succeeded on the same grounds." He nodded. He had known this from Bryn's rider, who had brought all 3 orders together in the same saddlebag. He had thought about Hale and Vesper, men he did not know well, men who had been in the same trap without knowing it was a trap, and felt something that was not exactly kinship, but was in that neighborhood. The world was full of men working hard, without understanding why what they worked for kept slipping away. Sometimes the difference between keeping what you had built and losing it was whether someone showed up who could see what you couldn't. "Your report," he said. "The final report for the land office." "Draft is complete," she said. "I want 2 more weeks of weight data before I finalize the projections. The numbers will be stronger for it." 2 more weeks, he said. "At a minimum." He looked at her. The September light was coming over the ridge at the angle his uncle had always said was the reason to pay attention in the morning. Ruth Hollis stood at his fence in that light with her ledger under her arm and a pen behind her ear and the expression of someone already thinking about the next thing that needed doing. "After the report is finalized," he said. She did not pretend not to understand what he was asking. "After the report is finalized," she said carefully, "there will be other work." "Here," he said, not a question. She looked at the pasture, at the cattle, at the fence lines that were tight and the water that was clean and the land that was recovering because someone had looked at it with the right kind of attention and had refused to stop looking. "The South Pasture rotation schedule runs through next spring," she said. "Someone should monitor the soil recovery at monthly intervals. The data would be valuable to the county extension office as well. There is very little published documentation of recovery timelines for overgrazed rangeland in this territory." "Someone," he said. "Someone who knows what they are looking at," she said. Yes, he understood her well enough by now to recognize this as the closest thing to a declaration she was capable of in the direct daylight of a September afternoon at a fence rail. He did not push it further than she had taken it. She was not a woman you pushed. She was a woman you gave room to, and she filled whatever room you gave her with something worth having. "The back bedroom faces east," he said. "Good light in the morning." "I noticed that on the first day," she said. "You notice everything on the first day." "Mostly," she said. A small movement at the corner of her mouth, the movement that was not quite a smile but carried all the weight of one. She went back to her cattle. He went back to the woodpile and picked up the axe. 3 weeks later, on an evening in early October, when the first genuine cold was coming down off the ridge and the grass had gone the color of old gold, Silas Dern came to the Cord Ranch for supper. He had come on his own, riding the 12 miles from his place east of town on a horse as old and deliberate as he was, arriving at the gate in the early evening with the ease of a man who had been meaning to do this for a while and had finally found the occasion. Elias met him at the gate and took his horse, and they walked up to the house together without saying much. The kitchen was warm. Ruth was at the stove she had been cooking more often lately, not because of any arrangement they had made, but because it had happened the way things happened between people working out how to share a space without ceremony or negotiation. Silas Dern sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room, the way old men looked at rooms, taking in not just what was there, but what the arrangement said about the people who had arranged it. The ledger on the side table, the notebook beside the coffee pot, the cattle weight charts pinned to the wall near the window, the clean, purposeful order of a space where serious work was being done by people who were comfortable with each other. He looked at all of it for a while in the manner of a man who had lived long enough to know that the important things were usually visible if you looked without hurry. Then he said, "Harold would have liked this." Elias was across the table, and he looked up from the cup he was holding. "The ranch looking right," Silas said. "Someone here who knows what she is doing." He looked at Ruth at the stove, his sharp old eyes taking her in with the same unhurried assessment he had applied to the room. "He used to worry about you being alone up here. Working alone, deciding alone, carrying it alone." "He did not need to worry about that," Elias said. "No," Silas said. "As it turns out, he did not." Ruth set a plate in front of the old man and one in front of Elias and sat down with her own. Silas looked at the food and then at her. "You are going to stay," he said. "Not a question." "The south pasture rotation runs through spring," she said. Silas smiled, a slow thing worked out from deep inside a face that did not produce expressions quickly or without cause. "That is not what I asked." Ruth looked at her plate. Then she looked across the table at Elias. Something moved between them in that look, the kind of communication that develops between people who have spent weeks making decisions under pressure in the same rooms, who have learned to read each other's thinking before it becomes words. "Yes," she said, "I am going to stay." Silas nodded once slowly with the satisfaction of a man confirming something he had hoped for. "Harold," he said to Elias, "spent the last year of his life trying to make sure you would have what you needed to keep this land. He was not able to do it the way he intended. Things were arranged against him that he felt but could not name." His voice was even unhurried. "But he wrote it down, didn't he? In that letter, that the land would tell the truth if someone was willing to listen." "He wrote that," Elias said. "The land told the truth," Silas said. He looked at Ruth. "You listened." She did not look up from her plate, but her hand resting on the table near the ledger she had set down when supper was served was still. Outside, the October wind came down off the ridge with the smell of the coming season in it. The smell that meant summer was finished, and what replaced it would require different preparations, different attention, different work. In the north pasture, the cattle moved in. The gathering dark settled, and gaining steadily on good grass, drinking from the redirected spring that had been there all along, documented legal belonging to this land, waiting for someone to find their way back to it. The south pasture rested under the first stars of October, its soil beginning the slow work of recovery that would continue through winter and into the spring and the spring after that. The patient biological repair of ground worked wrong for too many years now, being given what it needed, time and the right conditions and someone paying attention. Warren Voss was gone from Granger before November. The formal charges from the Territorial Attorney's Office came down in late October, 2 counts of fraud in the commission of a financial agreement, 1 count of conspiracy to devalue a secured asset, and a 4th count arising from the adjacent valley land purchase that Devlin's testimony had opened. He did not face a jury. He reached an agreement with the county that required him to surrender his financial interests in every property his lien held and to leave the territory. The details of the agreement were recorded in the county clerk's office and were available to anyone who wanted to read them, which several people did. No one in Granger appeared to miss him. Emmett Hale's lien was voided the same week as Elias's. Tom Vespers came through the week after. Both men went back to their land with the knowledge of what had been done to them and the harder knowledge that they would have to rebuild without the years that had been taken. Elias knew what that felt like. He thought about sending word to both of them. Then he thought about what kind of word was actually useful in that situation and decided that the most useful thing was not words at all, but the kind of evidence he had been shown that damaged land, given the right attention, could recover. That compromised systems diagnosed correctly could be corrected. That failure, when it had a cause, could be traced and addressed. He sent each of them through Bryn a copy of Ruth's preliminary assessment report on the Cord Ranch with a note suggesting they contact the land office about their own assessment needs. The barn roof held against the first October wind without a creak. The fence lines were tight. By the end of October, the Cord Ranch carried 24 head of cattle with a second calf expected in November, a water source clean and legally documented and going nowhere, and a south pasture resting toward the recovery that would take years and was already underway. The land office restructured the primary loan in September on terms that Roy Eldon described in his regional report to Billings as a model recovery case. Ruth's name appeared in that report as the consulting assessor. It appeared also the following February in the County Extension Office's quarterly agricultural bulletin under a short article on overgrazing recovery timelines in the Stillwater Valley. The byline read, Ruth Hollis, agricultural consultant, Cord Ranch, Stillwater Valley, Montana Territory. She framed nothing. She did not appear to notice the publication beyond reading it once and making 2 small notes in the margin of her own copy about data points she wanted to follow up in the spring assessment. Elias noticed. He did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say that would improve on what was already there, her name in print attached to work, that was sound and documented and would be read by people who needed to know what she knew. Some things did not require commentary. On the last evening of October, he came in from the north pasture after the final check of the day and found the kitchen lamp on, and Ruth at the table with her notebook open, writing in the small, precise hand that wasted nothing. The cattle weight projections for November, he guessed, or the spring rotation schedule, or the soil assessment follow-up notes she had mentioned wanting to begin. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He poured himself coffee from the pot she had left on the stove. He sat down across from her at the table that had held so many evenings of work over the past months. The ledger evidence, the document stacks, the water quality figures, the cattle charts, the legal filings. And now, the quieter ongoing work of a ranch that was no longer fighting to exist, but building toward what it could become. She did not look up. She was in the middle of something, and she finished it before she acknowledged him, which was the way she had always worked, and which he had come to understand was not indifference, but the integrity of someone who did not lose her place in the middle of a thought. Then she looked up. November projections, she said. If the weight gain trend holds through the cold stretch, we should be at 27 head by spring. 28 if the November calf comes in strong. That is 3 times what we had in June, he said. It is a beginning, she said, not an ending. He looked at her across the table, across the ledger she had brought with her on the first day, and filled with the evidence that had saved this land across the notebook she was filling now, with the evidence of what the land was becoming across the lamp that lit them both in the kitchen his uncle had built in 1871, and that was still standing because enough people had refused to let it fall. No, he said, it is not an ending. Outside, the October wind moved through the Stillwater Valley, and the ridge above the ranch stood dark against the last light of the sky, patient and permanent, belonging to no one, and framing everything. The north spring ran in the dark toward the troughs where the cattle drank. The south pasture rested under stars, its roots slowly finding their way back to what they were meant to do. The fence lines held. Harold Cord had built this place with the belief that a man who paid attention to his land would be rewarded for the attention. He had been right. He had simply not lived long enough to see what the attention looked like when it was finally fully paid. His nephew had learned it in 90 days from a woman with a ledger and working boots and a mind that turned evidence into clarity the way a mill turned grain into something useful. From a woman who had arrived at his gate on a Monday morning with nowhere particular invested in what she found, and had found something worth staying for. The lamp burned on the kitchen table of the Cord Ranch. The honest man's land held.